Let's talk about API mapping. This is an Excalidraw diagram that depicts a particular scenario. By the way, quick shout out to Excalidraw, which is such an awesome tool to create diagrams. So, on the right side here, we have a process that we've defined that fetches an order detail. We get the review, the order, shipping details, and product details, all to render on a page that the user is looking at. Now that you have this process definition, how do you connect this to your endpoint or your end user system? This is where API mappings can help you. Your users might be using a phone, a web, or through another external system, and all of these can actually run this particular process and get the response that you need. So how does that work? You can configure API mappings to your process definition such that each of these can have a very specific authentication mechanism. For example, you can have an API mapping pointing to this definition that external system in green calls using the authentication of Okta, and the external system in pink can use the Okta version 2. Could be different tenants in the same Okta or completely different Okta tenants. Similarly, the users who are using your app through phone could be authenticating themselves using Clerk or other popular authentication mechanisms, and they could be mapped as well through a separate API mapping. So you have the flexibility of running the same process, authenticated using different authentication mechanisms, and directly exposing it to your end user. You don't need a separate middleware or a separate API token or anything like that. Your regular authentication mechanism can be used to map the user to the actual endpoint that you're invoking. And this gives you a lot of flexibility and makes Unmeshed a truly PFF system where you can actually run all sorts of API calls for your front end directly on Unmeshed, thereby replacing or making Unmeshed the backend for your front end. Let's have a look inside Unmeshed. So this is the process definition we were referring in Excalidraw. Let's go ahead and see how we can create an API mapping for this. So let's say you want an endpoint that is meant for your phone. So you can say phone order detail API endpoint. You can say the definition is coming from the default namespace, and it is basically the fetch order detail endpoint. You can choose which version you want to run, and you can choose the security model, which is where you can choose between the different Okta instances, or even create a webhook URL that is unique to this particular use case. If you say default authentication, that is the same authentication mechanism that you use for logging into Unmeshed. It could be any number of other authentication mechanisms that you configure. So if you have configured them, you would be able to see that in the drop down here. And when working with tokens, you can also tell Unmeshed what sort of claims you want to capture from the authentication token, and that token claims will be passed on as inputs to your workflow definition as well. So if you have an email or a user ID that you want to capture from the token, you can specify that, and those values that are comma separated will be extracted from the token and passed as input to your workflow definition. So when your process runs, these tokens can be used to further authorize the calls. You no longer have to worry about authentication, as Unmeshed would have already taken care of that for you. When you save this, you can now invoke this endpoint using this endpoint API call phone order detail, which will in turn run this particular process definition based on the authentication mechanism you've chosen. In this case, it's the default, or you could be Okta or any of the other ones that you've configured. And then you can also decide what claims you want to pass on.